Welcome to Web Lecture 2.2. We're going to continue talking about the Constitution in this web lecture. We're going to move beyond the Bill of Rights, which we talked about was added to the Constitution in order to make a compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And today we're going to talk about the principles in the U.S. Constitution, or the sort of founding ideas that the Founding Fathers used to establish our Constitution, the basic principles that were laid out and then translated into specifics in the Constitution. And to beginning talking about that, we're going to talk about the sort of general idea of limited government. Now, we've talked about the idea of limited government when we talked about the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was created in 1215 to limit the power of the king in England. And so we took that principle, as we've talked about before, and applied that to our Constitution and our federal government. And so the Constitution is a direct idea of limited government, because the idea of the Constitution is to give specific powers to the federal government. It lists those powers that the federal government has, and even lists some of the powers that or lists the powers that it does not have. And so the Constitution really sets aside specific reserved powers for the federal government and then leaves all other powers to be determined by the states or even by the local government. And so this idea of limited government is exemplified in the Constitution in many different ways. Now, the first way we're going to talk about this idea of limited government is through federalism. Now, federalism is sometimes also referred to as division of powers, and that division of powers shows itself when the government is divided between the central government, or the federal government, and then the other political units, so like states in the United States or provinces in some place like Canada. And then when those political units take their power, then they leave other powers to even the county or the city governments as well. And so this idea of federalism limits the amount of government that the central government has, so that the people can have more say in their own government. Now, the federal government has certain powers, as does the state, as does the local, and sometimes those powers are shared. And one of the types of power that they have is the idea of expressed power. An expressed power is a power that is given only to the federal government. So an example of an expressed power is the power to declare war, because only the federal legislative branch can actually declare war. Massachusetts cannot decide that it wants to declare war on France, and so that is one of those expressed powers, a power that is only given to the federal government. The second type of power is a reserved power. Now, this is a power that is only given to the state government. This is not a power that the federal government has, but is given only to the states. Now, an example of a reserved power would be setting speed limits, because if you've noticed, North Carolina and South Carolina have different speed limits, and so it's up to the state to determine what their maximum speed limit is and what their speed limits are on different roads. And even in some states, they have no speed limits on highways. For example, Montana has no speed limit on some of their larger highways, because, well, if you've ever been to Montana, you know that there are not a lot of people there, and so there's not really a good chance that you're going to injure somebody if you're driving 100 miles an hour. So that's an example of reserved power, something that only the states have. And then some powers of the government are shared, or known as concurrent powers. These are powers that overlap between both the state and the federal government. And an example of a concurrent power is the power to collect taxes. Both the federal government and a lot of state governments collect different types of taxes. Sales taxes are state governments in a lot of cases, and both state and federal government collect income taxes. Now, not all states have either sales taxes or income taxes. Some states have both, but it is the power of the federal government and the state government both to collect taxes, and that's an example of concurrent power. Now, when we're looking at this idea of limited government, it begs the question, who's in charge? And so when we look at this idea, or this question of who's in charge, we can talk about this principle of popular sovereignty. Now, if we break that down, we can look at the word sovereignty and break it down into its root words, and we look at the word here, R-E-I-G-N, and that word is reign. And so if we look at the word reign, we know that that is what that's somebody's power over something. And so if we look at sovereign, that means that that's the person that's in charge. So if we look at the word popular sovereignty, then this is that the people are in charge. And so this idea means that the government is subject to the will of the people. And if a law is to have legitimacy, then it has to be based on that consent of the people that are being governed. And we've talked about the idea of the social contract, where we give up certain freedoms in order to be protected by our government, and that goes hand in hand with this idea of popular sovereignty. So this is a very important idea or principle in our government, because clearly we have the ability to get rid of people or elect people that we want to be in power through our right to vote. So popular sovereignty is a very direct way that it shows that the people are in charge. Now, another idea about who is in charge is this principle of majority rule. And so this is sort of why we, as we talked before, that the Electoral College was set up, because we wanted to make sure that as far as the president goes, that there wasn't too much power in the majority. But for most cases, particularly when it comes to Congress, and even when it comes to most voting, it is exactly that allows decisions to be made. So this majority rule is the idea that you have to have one more than half of the people that cast a vote to agree in order to make a decision. So in Congress, in order to pass a law, you have to have a majority vote, and to get somebody elected, you have to have a majority rule decision for that to happen. So this shows that the people, or the majority of the people in this case, are in charge. Now, we continue to ask this question, who's in charge, with the principle of separation of powers. Because in this idea of separation of powers, it shows that we have this split between three different branches of government. And the reason we have this idea of separation of powers is because we don't want any one group of people in the government to have too much power. And so we took this idea of splitting up the government into three different branches. And so each branch has its own specific powers that they can have. And those powers do not overlap. So the legislative branch does not have the same powers as the executive branch, which does not have the same powers as the judicial branch. And in this case, they can also not only separate their powers, but they can also check each other's powers. And so this idea of checks and balances comes into play, which is based on the theory of Baron de Montesquieu. And we've talked about Montesquieu before, how he influenced our government with this idea of checks and balances, where one branch has power over the other, or can check the other branch by either vetoing or overriding their decision if they feel that it is not in line with the Constitution. And so this idea of checks and balances is very important when it comes to limiting the power of one or more of the branches of government.